MLB Pipeline recently came out with their top 100 prospects for 2021, and I'm here to talk to you about the list and prospecting in baseball. There are two main prospect lists that you should be checking out if you are looking into baseball prospecting. The first one is the one that we're going to talk about today with the MLB Pipeline. That is run by MLB, so I think that one is very important. The other one is Baseball America. Typically, you will see players on these lists have very similar rankings. Last year, Luis Robert was a guy that did vary from the Baseball America checklist to the top 100 prospects from MLB Pipeline. So, the one thing that I want to get off the bat that I think is really good is that we're seeing actually more of the prospects being featured on the MLB's Instagram page. If you followed around the time of when this prospect list came out, you probably saw that MLB actually posted probably 4 to 5, maybe even 6 times about these prospects that were new. And that was one of the main things that, in my opinion, is one of the biggest problems that MLB has with their marketing in general, is that they don't market the prospects well enough. Because if you were to ask the casual baseball fan who's the best young player, they probably aren't going to know who Wander Franco is. They may not even know who, some of these other players on the list are. And Wander Franco is the top prospect on the list. People might not know who that is. And I think that is a big issue when it comes to what the MLB Pipeline is doing, or what the MLB marketing is doing, that they're not marketing these players as they're on their way up. People knew Vladimir Guerrero Jr., people knew Shohei Ohtani as they were coming up because they were like humongous names that kind of transcended that list. But like Wander Franco, for example, he's a player for the Rays. Now, he was on the 60-man roster last year for the Rays kind of in that weird season. And I think, one thing that I think is going to be an interesting kind of change to this year compared to last year is the fact that the MLB is probably going to have almost a full season. MLB and baseball in general was probably affected the most by COVID because their season they were in the middle of spring training when everything shut down last March. So, they were in the middle of spring training. They didn't have the full regular summer that they usually have. And they started, and, they also didn't have any minor league seasons. And that's a big deal because a lot of these young prospects didn't get the work that they usually do in the minors coming up. Now, I don't know what would have happened if we would have seen like a player like Wander Franco make his major league debut last year compared to maybe making it this year. I don't think he's going to make it at the beginning of the season. Like, we did see the Series 1 checklist come out, and it has a ton of huge names, even some names that are on this prospect list. That's probably going to be something I talk about separately, probably next week when the product actually comes out. But baseball in general was affected the most. Like I said, they had no minor league regulars, no minor league season at all. They didn't have the fall league. The MLB draft was also limited. Usually, I think it's about 40 rounds, and last year it was only, I think, 5 rounds, which is huge. So there's tons of probably players who didn't get signed or didn't get drafted that are going to be out there that you may see in a few years be in the majors that people didn't know about because they just, in 2020, there was really not that much of a draft. So, that was another thing. There also was a shortened season where, they were supposed to, usually the season starts in April and it goes until October. I don't think the season started until like July or August. So, I think the main issue there is that they also had to compete against the NBA and NHL playoffs, which, for baseball, that's big for them. The ratings for baseball haven't been great over the past decade. You've kind of seen some increases and decreases, more decreases. But one of the main things that they had was that it was, during the summer, it was the only sport going on. And, when you had the NBA playoffs, which last year's NBA playoffs were really good. So that was kind of one of the other things. You probably saw an even smaller decrease. So I'm sort of making a prediction in this video that I think that the MLB and baseball cards are actually going to have an interesting opportunity this year specifically because of what happened last year. I think they're going to have an interesting increase, and they may even increase similarly to what happened to basketball last year. Once some of these young players get into the majors and once the kind of season gets started, I think people are going to be excited because also you look at it and you say, well, they're probably going to still have to go up against the MLB, they're going to have to go up against the NHL and NBA, at least maybe for some of the season during spring training. But like, I look at it and I say, I think that people are going to be interested in baseball. At least this is my prediction. I think people are going to be interested in baseball because during the summer, it probably is going to be the only thing that is on TV. So now to get into the list and some of these prospecting cards in general. So number one, we still had Wander Franco. He's been the number one prospect, I believe, going all the way back to 2019. The number one pick in the 2020 draft. Spencer Torkelson, he plays for the Detroit Tigers. He is number 3. That's kind of an interesting, you typically will see these number 1 picks make their way up to the rankings. I think it's pretty interesting to see him up at number 3. And then 4 and 5, I think, is where the list gets pretty crazy. And I think in the future, this is going to be one of the best outfields in the league. You have Jared Kelenic, and then you also have Julio Rodriguez, who are two prospects coming up through that system. So Julio Rodriguez, he has a card from 2019, the same year as Wander Franco, first Bowman Chrome card. And then Kelenic, I forget when his year was specifically. I think it was 2018, but he actually came over in, I believe, the Robinson Cano trade. So I think that trade may be a pretty bad one if Kelenic turns out to be a real player, because Cano, he was kind of towards the end of his career in a way. Like he's getting paid a pretty significant amount, so to trade Kelenic like that was definitely an interesting move. And then probably the player that everyone is the most excited about, but also probably has the most risk if you're buying his cards, is Jasson Dominguez. He is at 32. And I believe he is actually the youngest prospect to ever be on the top 100 list. So he was an international prospect that now is with the Yankees. And, I think that's kind of the thing. It's like, if you look at the MLB's marketing, they actually compared him, and he was one of the featured players, which I thought was very interesting, because if you think about this list, I'm surprised that they didn't put him a little bit higher based on how excited people are for him to make it into the prospecting kind of the pool of prospects, and then also making it to the league. I think he's 17 still, but like MLB, they posted that his comps are going to be, or he's compared to, it's Mike Trout, Mickey Mantle, and I think Barry Bonds was the other one. I forget. I'll put a graphic up here with that specific graphic, because I just thought it was hilarious, because someone that has a card account has to be the one running that, because if you see the prices people are paying on Jasson Dominguez, those comps make a lot of sense. But like at the same time, he's 17 years old, so it's like, how can you? No pressure for him. Like, he's already in the Yankee system. He's already being compared to the next Mike Trout, which, that's kind of the thing with baseball, is like every prospect you kind of compare, like at least from what I've seen, most prospects are compared to Mike Trout. He's one of the best players, probably the best player of this generation. Any good prospect coming through the system, you heard probably similar things about a player like Luis Robert, who is built similarly to Mike Trout in a way, and I think kind of interesting. He actually had a kind of a crazy card sell in the Golden Auctions, which I'm going to talk about in another video and then probably later on in this podcast. But he was definitely getting those comparisons to Mike Trout in a way. So, you see these players, pretty crazy, that all of them, all the good ones really that come up that are either, young or they have a ton of potential, they're compared to Mike Trout. And it's not every prospect is going to be Mike Trout, obviously. Mike Trout, I believe, was a number 1 prospect. If you look at the number 1 prospects that have been in the past, for the most part, they have been hits. Byron Buxton, I think, has had some injury issues, and that's one reason why he hasn't exactly panned out the way that people probably hoped he would. But I think if you look at a lot of the number 1 prospects, which if you listen to, I listen to Slabstocks, and Nate is a great baseball analyst, and he says that Wander Franco is the real deal. So, if you listen to a lot of people talk, Wander Franco, he is the real deal, and he's going to be probably coming up this year, hopefully making his debut. I don't know if that means he'll be in Series 2 or Topps Update. If he makes his debut early enough in the season, that probably will be the case, but I wouldn't be surprised if he makes his debut later on in the year, that he was held out until next year's Topps Series 1, which is crazy to think. I'm looking forward already till next year's Topps Series 1 when this year's hasn't even come out yet. So now I'm going to talk about pricing of these prospects, and I think it's a very similar conversation that I've had in the past about buying young players and young prospects. I think prospecting in baseball is probably one of the most popular ecosystems when it comes to baseball cards. And I think people even get more excited for prospects than they do players who are in the league, because if you compare some of the prices of Jasson Dominguez, some of the prices of Wander Franco, they're very comparable to a lot of like the stars in the league right now. Like I was looking at Wander Franco cards, and they're in the 230, 250. I saw one sell for 300 the other day. You know, it's the same thing with basketball. Like these players have to go on to be they have to be really good in the league, and they have to make it to the league first. Like Wander Franco hasn't even played an MLB game yet. So, you know, looking at those prices, I think it's tough for me to justify buying any prospects that are not either in the majors or like have made their debut yet, just because of the way that so much can happen. You know, for example, like for the most part, I think I was reading an article, and I think it was on Baseball America, saying that the average prospect spends 4 years in the minors. And I think with prospecting, it's very interesting the amount of opportunities that the player has for their cards to increase in value. It's a little bit different than basketball. And I think it's because you get that first Bowman Chrome, which is basically a pre-rookie card. You know, if they make their way up the minors, you probably will see a little bit of an increase. If they start making some rounds and making some noise, that's where you'll start to see some increases. But then once they make it to, I think AA is typically where you'll see players go from AA to the majors. So if they make it to AA and they're playing well, and then they come up to the majors, that's when you will probably see a little bit of an increase. And then they have to start playing well in the majors really for those prices to justify. So, you know, with prospecting, I think you're going to see a lot of prospects in the next few years kind of come out of nowhere, like I was talking about with the short list of the draft. And I think with a lot of these players not getting a lot of time, like, you know, I think there's going to be players that people don't know much about that are maybe in the bottom half or the bottom part of the top 100 that make their way into the majors that end up getting their cards to be pretty expensive. And I think, you know, when I prospect, or at least when I'm buying cards of players that are younger, which I don't typically do, but I have a bit of a cutoff. It's going to be probably in the $2 to $6 range for one of their cards, and that's even probably a little bit more expensive. You know, I want to go boom or bust with these prospects. I just don't think the risk of buying a player like a Wander Franco or a Jasson Dominguez, you know, buying one or two of them is good, but loading up on these prospects, I just view as extremely risky. And, you know, with sports cards, I think you're still in a point with baseball that there's so many players that are low risk, high rewards still with baseball. I think the sport in general is a little bit underpriced just because of what happened last year. And I think, you know, if you're buying a player in that $2 to $4 to $5 to $6 range, like, you know, that's not really somebody that is, you know, super highly ranked, I would imagine. You know, I would need to look into some examples specifically, but I think the $2 to $6 range is where I would be okay if the cards never really increase. But like if I'm buying a Wander Franco or I'm buying a Jasson Dominguez card, you know, I need that card to go on to be pretty expensive, and that's just kind of a fact there where, you know, you never know what's going to happen with these prospects. So you never know, like, if Wander Franco turns into, you know, the next Byron Buxton, where he gets to the league and it just doesn't end up working out. Like, what happens then? You know, I think a lot of people are buying a lot of Wander Franco and Jasson Dominguez, and I keep saying their names because they're probably the top two investments, or the excitement level are probably the highest of those two players compared to any of the other prospects on this list. But I think that you're going to have an opportunity this year to maybe buy some cheaper prospects if you want to do this. And I think it is definitely exciting because, you know, prospecting, especially with baseball, is like you're knowing about somebody, or you buy somebody 3, 4, 5 years before maybe they end up being kind of a mainstream player. So that's kind of another reason why people really like prospecting. But I just think the potential risk of these top guys isn't really worth it. And I think if you are looking to prospect, I would just look in maybe a boom or bust type of range where you're okay spending the money on a card of a guy that people may not know yet, rather than spending the money on a guy like a Wander Franco or a Jasson Dominguez. Thank you for watching the video. If you liked, make sure you hit the subscribe button. And after you hit subscribe, comment done below. And if you liked the video, make sure you hit the like button. Thank you.